God created Adam and Eve, put them in the Garden of Eden. Sin wasn't there. Adam and Eve, what? Failed. You know, and here we have Dan, who they'd rather steal than fight. We need somebody who will come in and win for us. Judges chapter 18 is where we are. And as I said last week, we are rapidly coming to the end of Judges. And honestly, I'm kind of bummed out about that. I'm really getting a lot out of this book myself. I hope you are. Especially the days we live in. I said last week that it just feels like we're in that kind of a time in our day. And to see how it didn't matter how crazy things got or get, we're going to see in the book of Judges during that time of the judges for Israel, God's plan did not waver. The people did. Everything just became unhinged, and we haven't even seen the worst yet. But God's plan never changed. It just marched straight on, and any of God's people who would follow the commandments and the covenant of the Lord could walk right through this with a sense of assurance and a clarity about wrong and right and how to know God and so forth, when the rest of the people around them are just in utter confusion. Now this tonight, I call it the Danites and the wrong side of history. But this is actually a part 2 from last week, because we're still dealing with Micah and the Levite. But now we're going to add to this storyline, and I mean that in the historical sense, the Danites as they migrate north, and what that means and why the Lord has added this to His Word. So let's look there, chapter 18. You know, lately we've heard commented about certain people that, quote, they will end up on the wrong side of history. Have you heard that on the news? That's a new catchphrase. We've been about 6 years. That sort of started during the COVID time, it seems like. But we started hearing that anybody that disagreed about something was going to land on the wrong side of history. Of course, this has been used mostly by progressives intending to leverage the unknown future against those whom they believe disagree with them. It's meaningless, actually, a way for commentators who have no facts or arguments to intimidate people to intimidate people according to their viewpoints. I mean, how do you have the wrong side of history? How does the news reporter know what is the wrong side of history or what is the right side of history? The only way anyone can make this charge against another is if the reality that we live in is in fact judged by an absolute timeless standard. The only way that anybody could say that a person lands on the wrong side of history is if there is an absolute truth. And anybody that crosses that is on the wrong side of history. But the problem is the people doing this, progressives, they disavow the concept of absolute truth. Therefore, they cannot, with integrity, use this statement. Some people could use it, but they can't, because progressives don't believe in absolute truth. According to them, you have your truth, I have my truth, everybody has their truth. So if everybody has their own truth, then how is there a wrong side of history? Seems like to me, every side of history would be okay, don't you think? But if there's an absolute standard, a plumb line that's eternal, that outlasts history, then we run the risk of being outside of it, don't we? And that's something here that only those who disobey God's truth, His commandments, and reject His Son can land on the wrong side of history. We see this happening in the actions taken and the decisions that are made by the tribe of Dan in Judges chapter 18. In this chapter, Micah and his Levites, religious racket, meet the Danites as they abandon their inheritance in the south of Canaan and migrate northward to claim a new one. Now, I'll warn you as we go into this, there are no good guys. Okay? Everybody in this story is a bad guy. Okay? I don't even know if there are any degrees of good or bad. It's just rotten people making rotten decisions that is destroying civilization as they know it. And we see having the ability, so many thousands of years later, we're able to say these people landed on the wrong side of history. So somebody's keeping track. And of course, you and I know who that is. And that is the Lord God. So we see this chapter is primarily, the spotlight is on the tribe of Dan. Dan, we're going to find out, was the weakest tribe of the 12 that went into Canaan. And so the first thing we're going to see here is the lack of character here is that the tribe of Dan, they're cowards. They're a bunch of cowards. And I know that maybe that sounds harsh. I think you'll agree with me before it's over, but you say, well, they're migrating north because, as the text says here, which is really kind of nice the way it translates it, and I believe even says it in the original, their inheritance had not fallen to them yet. That's a very nice way, a very merciful way to say they failed. They failed. God gave them much more than what they're going to get here in this account. But we see here that they actually were given an inheritance. They failed to secure the land that God gave them. The reason they're wandering around is because they did not do what God told them to do. In fact, one scholar, K. Lawson Younger Jr., he said this: just as the wayward Levite sought a place to settle, so the text describes a wayward tribe seeking a place to settle. If you remember last week, we had this Levite that is looking for a place to live. And then he gets hired on by Micah, who stole a bunch of money from his mother, then gave it back. Then she gave him some back, and then went and made themselves some idols and created a little shrine, a house of worship. And then comes the Levite, and he says, well, hey, this is great. I can hire a Levite to run my house, my shrine, and that'll give it some legitimacy. And that's what they did. Now, it's not just the Levite that's wandering around instead of doing what he's supposed to be doing at Shiloh, where the tabernacle is. We've got now a tribe. Rather than go and take the land that God had given them, has been chased off of that land, and now they're looking for some land somewhere else. Let me read you a little bit of the history here. Joshua chapter 19, down in verse 47, we hear of when Dan was given their allotment, their land allotment. And it says, when the territory of the people of Dan was lost to them, the people of Dan went up and fought against Leshem, and after capturing it and striking it with a sword, they took possession of it and settled in it. But in verses 40 through 46, it says, and the seventh lot came out of the tribe of the people of Dan according to their clans. And the territory of its inheritance included Zorah, Eshtaol. So they're leaving the place that God actually gave them. Because remember where they said, it says that they were leaving? Eshtaol and Zorah. And they're going to go up here to where Micah and this Levite are. So they're literally leaving the land that God gave them. So Zorah, Eshtaol, Irshemesh, Shalabin, Aijalon, Ithla, Elon, Timnah, Ekron, Eltekeh, Gibbethon, and Baalath, Jehud, and Benak Barak, and Gath Rimmon. Now, several of those are Philistine capital cities, so they had a hard task. But, you see, they went in, they initially took some land, but we find out that they also lost what little bit that they got. If we look back in Judges chapter 1, verse 34, it says, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. So Dan has gone in, conquered a little bit of the land, but then the Amorites came back and then forced the tribe of Dan up into the hill country and wouldn't let them come down into the fertile valley area where they could raise crops and graze cattle and their sheep and so forth. So they're kind of trapped up in the mountains or the mountain area there. And it appears that the tribe of Dan is shrinking, because if we look here, it says in Joshua, it says that the land is divided up according to the clans of Dan. So there's many clans, which a clan involves more than one family. So you've got this wing and that wing, and you may have that in your family, But so we're talking a large group. But it's very clear as we move through this account that Dan is much, much smaller. So they're not reproducing, and they're not taking the land that God gave them. They failed. And so they decide that they're going to pick out they're going to pick out, what was it? Was it 5 men? 6? 5, yeah, okay. Now I want you to see something that's more of a literary thing. The writer here, under the inspiration of the Spirit, is making a contrast, okay? And he's going to use language that sounds like Israel coming out of Egypt and going into Canaan. So way back in the book of Exodus, all right? So we're going to say Exodus. And now we're going to say Judges, or no, let's say Dan. We'll call it Dan. When it came time, they came to Canaan. What did was one of the first things that Moses did? He sent in what? Spies. And when they came back, they said, oh, it's a great land and all that, but it's just too big for us. We can't do it. And so Joshua and Caleb were the only two that said, it's a great place. God's given it to us. Let's go get it. Well, they spent 40 more years being chastised by the Lord because they didn't have faith. After that 40 years, what was the first thing that was done? Spies were sent in again. These spies came back and they said, it's a wonderful land and we can do it. God's given it to us. That's the part that we want to keep in our mind. Because how were they, the good spies, how were they saying that they were going to go into Canaan and conquer the land? By the power of God. By the power of God. So I'm just going to say God. Okay? Now here's what we're to notice as we go through this. We'll see different things that match. Is that Dan will take the city of Laish, and they'll make it into the city of Dan, but without God. So when you see this language in chapter 18 that seems to say, okay, well, the Danites are not doing the right thing, and yet it's using language like they're doing the same thing that Moses and Joshua did. Well, the reason is not to commend the tribe of Dan. It is to show how that the tribe of Dan, God doesn't even enter into their mind. God gave them an inheritance. They walk right off and leave it. They send in spies or, to search out the land for new land, not the ones that God gave them, new land. There's no prayer, there's no report, there's no reference to the covenant or to the commandments, nothing. We need some land. Let's go get some. And that's what they do. So they happen across Micah's house, which is a shrine. Okay? In verses 2 through 6, we see that. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and they lodged there. And when they were there in the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of a young Levite. Now, did they recognize his accent? Or did they actually recognize his voice? Because remember, the Levite is from the southern part of Canaan. And there are differences. Remember, Sibboleth and Shibboleth. There are differences in the way, just like in the United States, less now than used to, but you had different parts that had different accents, and that was true in Israel as well. So are they hearing that and say, oh, well, that's a Shiloh accent? Or are they hearing, oh, I know that guy? Either way, they hear the voice of the priest and they go to him and they say, what are you doing here? How did you get here? And the priest says, hey, this is what happened. Micah hired me to be his priest. And of course, he says that with no conscience at all. They receive that with no conscience at all. Everything's fine. And why? They're cowards. Why do they not take their land? Because they're afraid. Because they won't trust God. They won't fight their enemies. It says that the Amorites chased them up into the hill country and would not allow them to come back down. Is that what God said would happen? And we say, well, maybe they weren't strong enough. But if we dig a little closer, we find out that Dan and the tribe of Judah, which was the strongest military tribe, and Ephraim, but Judah was to be the leader. If you remember, we talked about that. So Dan was very close to Judah. And remember, if you can think back, we said that God expected tribes to help each other. Well, Dan just went in, took a little bit of land, then got chased out, and then that was that. They didn't do it. They were cowards. Then next we see that the tribe of Dan was, or they are unjust. They're unjust. Look at verse 7. Then the 5 men departed and came to Laish and saw the people who were there. Now I want you to listen to the way these people in Laish are described. Because the Bible says this about them twice. So we're supposed to, and it's just one description upon another, and they're all good. Okay? So we're being sent a message here. All right? It says that the people who were there, how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians or the Phoenicians. Quiet, unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth. They were far from, now notice this, far from the Sidonians, and they had no dealings with anybody else. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, "What do you report?" And they said, "Arise, let us go up against them. For we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good." Doesn't that sound exactly like what the spies who were faithful said? You see, there's that language. "And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given," well, there's God, but God's not in this. "For God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth." This is part of the syncretism of taking a little bit of Yahweh, and the rest of it is all paganism. Okay, so occasionally they will refer to God, but they're really just idolaters, which we saw that last week, didn't we? With the priest. So we see that they found a way around God's command. Rather than fight for the land that God gave them, they went and found what? A people who live in security, who are quiet, unsuspecting, lacking in nothing, who possess wealth, and they were far from any allies, and they didn't have anybody around that could help them. They're predators. They won't fight for their own land, but they're willing to go in here and murder a bunch of people that are just dwelling peacefully, not bothering a soul. In fact, I'm told that in the Hebrew, the way these people are described, like what I just pointed out there, those words, the way these people are described, it's hearkening back to the way the people of Israel are supposed to be living by now in the land of Canaan. They're supposed to be by now living in security and quietness. They're supposed to be lacking nothing in wealth. But they're not. And why? Because they've forsaken the covenant of God, and they're serving idols, and therefore they're not able to take the land as God told them He would enable them. So they found a way around it. They said, basically, you got to fight to take this land. But hey, these are unsuspecting people. We could go up here, surprise these people, and kill them, take their land from them. So you see how unjust they are. There's no integrity here. There's no godliness in the tribe of Dan at this point. They are just looking, they are the only tribe at this point who still does not have their own inheritance completely. They don't have their own city. So the first thing they do is name this place Dan, because they're feeling left behind. And so what do? Well, rather than work for it, they steal it. So they found a way to take land from peaceful neighbors. So 600, verse 11, so 600 of the men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol and went up and encamped in Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Mahana Dan. In other words, it literally just means Dan's camp. So in other words, they camped there. The 600 armed men camped in that area. Behold, it is the west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim, which is north. And they came to the house of Micah. Then we see the tribe of Dan are thieves. They're thieves. On more than one, you're like, well, I see that, Pastor. They are stealing these people's land. Well, they're not done stealing. They got more stealing to do. So verse 14, then the 5 men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, do you not know that in these houses, now they're at Micah's house, Micah's compound, and at his compound is this house of worship there. He says, in this house there is an ephod, there is the teraphim or the household gods, a carved image, and a metal image. Now therefore, consider what you will do. And they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite at the house of Micah and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. So they come upon, the 5 men had lodged there. They met the priest and saw all this, taking note of what was there. Then they went back, said, hey, we found a place. We can easily take these people's city. But on the way there, they stop again at Micah's house of worship, and they decide, well, we're going to go in, take all these gods, and they even decide they'd like to have a priest too. So they were willing to make war when it was time to steal. Notice how it says there in verse 17, at the very end. It says that the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. Twice we're told this 600 men is armed for war. Why couldn't they take the land that God gave them? Because they weren't willing to go to war. What was one of the reasons, if you can remember, this is a small detail, but you may remember that one of the things that in Joshua and at the early stages of Judges, God said He wanted to teach the people how to make war. Why? Because they were going to have to do war to take the land. So here are people who won't fight for what God gave them. But now that it's time to steal some gods, steal a defunct priest, steal somebody's city, they got weapons of war now. They're ready. They're ready to go and take what they want. I'll let you make whatever applications you want there, but, I could easily see how often this might, in our lives, it might not fall into violence, war or whatever, but in church life or in our own personal lives. How often God opens a door and He's going to bless us, but it's going to take some work. Or we can take the easy way out, which comes with some dishonest dealings. We make a mistake sometimes thinking that the will of God is always easy. I don't know where that came from. Does God sometimes do things that it's like, well, yeah, God's divided the Red Sea. They walked right on dry ground to the other side. Look how easy He made it. Well, let's remember that they were 400 years down in Egypt. They were in slavery toward the end, building treasure cities that they did not want. Pharaoh was killing their male children. They were chased to that point where the sea needs to open up. And I don't know about you, but I don't know if I would feel very comfortable even on dry ground with, 10, 20 stories of water over me that any second could collapse down on top of me. That doesn't sound easy. None of that sounds easy to me. That sounds hard. That sounds a little scary. And God told them, go into the land. If you remember, I said that it's sort of like God said, now go in there and fight, but I've rigged the fight. You're going to win. I've given you the land. But you are going to have to fight for it. And here we have Dan, who they'd rather steal than fight. Some people would rather steal than work. They'd rather steal or deceive than they would do something honest. We see that in the world. Unfortunately, sometimes we even see it in the Lord's people. I hesitate to go there, but the Apostle Paul said, if a man strives for the mastery in the King James Version, what does that mean? It means if a young man feels led to strive, to pursue ministry, let him do it honestly, with integrity. Wonder why he says something like that. Another thing he says later, Timothy, don't lay hands on anyone suddenly. And again, I'm quoting the King James Version. What does he mean by that? He's saying, do not lay the hands of ordination upon a young man too quickly, or a man too quickly. Don't put them in the ministry too quickly. They need to work. They need to be tested. They need to prove themselves that they are trustworthy. They're men of integrity. And so, I don't know, I see a lot of application here that can affect the church and our lives that, we don't want to be thieves. We want to earn honestly what the Lord gives us. Not earn, but you know what I mean. Follow the Lord's path. Do the things that He's called us to do individually. Suffer if that's what happens. Humbly and obey God and allow, if God wants to elevate us, fine. If God doesn't want to elevate us, He's in charge. That's all that matters. But it takes a lot of integrity to do this. What makes a thief is not so much what they take, it's what's in their heart. They've stolen way before they ever put their hands on something, haven't they? In their hearts, they've already gone and taken whatever it may be. It may not even be a material thing, even though here it was. They cut a new deal with the dishonest priest. It says, they said, and Micah, verse 18, then when these went into Micah's house and took the carved images, the ephod, the household gods, the metal image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" They said to him, "Keep quiet. Put your hand on your mouth and come with us and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of one man, or to the priest to a tribe and a clan in Israel?" And the priest's heart was glad. Why? He just got a raise. He got a promotion. It says, "Be quiet. Put your hand on your mouth." You know what that means? Shh. You can be a part of this too. We're going to take all these gods, and you know what? We need a priest. And we're a whole tribe. Think about how well we could take care of you. And the priest's heart's like, "Oh, I've been waiting on this. This is sweet." And he joins them. And then they were willing to murder Micah. So Micah figures out that in verses 21 through 26 that he's been robbed. And somebody's taken all of his gods, and they took his priest, and they're headed out of there. So Micah gets his men. He doesn't have 600 armed men, but he has a band of men. It's clear Micah is a man of means. So Micah catches up with them, and basically, as he comes hurrying up behind them, they do a bit of what we call it, gaslighting. Now Micah's been robbed, and they turn back to him, and they shout to him, "What's the matter with you that you come out with us and all this company?" Excuse me? Aren't you the thieves? And you act like I'm doing something wrong? But you see how unjust, how corrupt they have become. So, and then they threaten his life. They said, you take my gods and that I made and the priest and go away, and what have I left? Boy, isn't that sad? You take my gods and my priests, and I don't have anything left. How then do you ask me, what is the matter with you? And the people of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of all the household." And so they turned around and went back. What's that? Hey, I'm not going to be able, you need to be quiet here, because there's some guys in our group, I can't control them. You keep running your mouth, a couple of these guys probably going to kill you and all your men with you. So you might all just go back to your house. And that's what he did. He realized he couldn't win. And the irony, how did Micah have his gods and his priest? Thievery. He stole from his own mother. And now the man who was a thief is robbed. Interesting, isn't it? Then the last part, we see the tribe of Dan, they're idolaters. They're idolaters. Oops. They're idolaters. We already see that, don't we? We see that they've stolen these gods and all that, but it gets worse. Verse 27, but the people of Dan took what Micah had made and the priests who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. Notice how the Bible constantly speaks well of these people. Now, were they Jewish? No. Were they part of the covenant? No. but they weren't part of God's promise to Dan. And these people were living peacefully. And yet, Dan goes in and massacres. They kill everyone in the city. And there was none to deliver because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone else. So it was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rohab. Beth Rohab was another city that could have come to help them, but they really didn't know them, and they didn't really care, so they let them get killed. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it, and they named the city Dan. And after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel, that is the son of Jacob, whose name was Dan, but the name of the city was Laish at the first. So they murdered the people of Laish in ferocity. They just murdered these people who probably hardly even fought back. And then we see they rebuilt the city and set up idolatry. And then we're going to read something here that might shock you. Remember I said this priest, they heard his voice and they said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, did they recognize his accent? Or did they actually recognize his voice?" Well, there's a good reason to believe that they recognized his voice. Because look down as we go, verse 30, "And the people of Dan set up in the carved images for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites until the day of the captivity of the land." So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So here we are. Was this Moses' great-great-grandson? Maybe. But it was definitely down the list somewhere in there. Moses through Gershom, and then somewhere down in here, whether it's his great-great-grandson or maybe a little more. But this is of the line of Moses. We might say the most revered family in the whole of Israel. And what was he doing? Selling himself for hire and leading in idolatrous worship. If we needed any other illustration about how utterly the scene had fallen, I don't know what we could get. We already don't have judges. And now we see that the tribes are becoming just corrupt to the core. And now we see the organization, the very people that God ordained to protect the covenant, the priests, have fallen. They have fallen. Utter depravity. Now, I'm going to say this before we wrap up and before we come to this last section of the book of Judges. Remember how I'm going to show you a little bit of a theological thing here, okay? God created Adam and Eve, put them in the Garden of Eden. The sin wasn't there. Adam and Eve, what? Failed. God set that, gave them a way to atone for their sins. But then over the course of time, man became filled with violence. God judged the world through a flood. That civilization, the nations, failed. God gave the post-flood people an opportunity to create a new world, a new Eden. And they built the Tower of Babel, started false religion. They failed. The nations failed. So God said, I'm going to call out one nation. Since all the other ones I've disinherited, I'm going to call one. I'm going to call Abraham. And so we see Abraham come into this picture. And now we've come in to God delivers them out of Egypt, which I don't think was a judgment, but he delivers them out of Egypt. But then they won't go into the land. They failed. But then God gets them into the land after 40 years through Moses and Joshua. And then they go into the time of the judges. God is raising up judges. And now we come to the end of Judges. There are no judges. The tribes are failing. The priests are failing. Israel's failing. Failed, 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 failed. Now, I'm going to tell you, you're going to see that pattern all the way through the Old Testament. Why? Because the point is this: we always fail. We're sinners. We have turned on God. We have rebelled against Him. We need somebody who will come in and win for us. And God knew that. And that was His Son. Jesus did not fail. Everything else failed. We're going to continue as we study. We're going to see failure, 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 failure. But God sends His Son who wins on our behalf. So this is how we wind up on the wrong side of history, because we have decided to disregard God's Word.